Welcome to Suburban Warrior, the podcast that will impact, inspire, and empower you to transform your mindset and become the badass warrior that you are. I'm your host and fellow warrior, Chrissy Pfeiffer, former clinician and corporate marketing exec turned multi-passionate entrepreneur, performance and life coach, and mom to 4 not-so-little warriors. Each week, I will bring you honest conversations with inspiring guests to share their stories of resilience, optimism, success, and simple yet effective strategies so that you transform your thoughts and change your behavior to get the results you want in your life. You will be empowered to take action, warrior up, and believe in you. Let's do this. What's up, warriors? Welcome back to another episode of the Suburban Warrior Podcast. I am so excited about this amazing warrior that I have with us today. Tarah Epstein Baiman is the founder of Bold Wellness, a transformative and holistic health services company focused on optimizing mind, body, and soul alignment. Tarah is a certified wellness coach, an orphan, and a trauma survivor advocate who also founded a nonprofit organization, the Orphan Society of America, which provides niche services for youth who've lost their parents to violence. She is a single mom who lives in Merion Station, PA, with her 2 children and her 2 dogs. Welcome to the podcast, Tarah.
Hi, Chrissy. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. And like I said, you are truly a suburban warrior because I have known you, just through, obviously I order essential oils from you and we've met that way. But it wasn't until I read one of your Instagram posts about, what you have been through, about the trauma that you went through as a child. And I have to say that I was in tears. I had chills and I was just so amazed at your honesty and authenticity to be able to share that story. And I instantly thought I have to have her on the podcast to share with others. So I want to thank you for showing up today and for doing this, because I know that's not easy. And I think your story will impact and help a lot of other people. So thanks for being here today.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure. I feel like it's my responsibility and what I've experienced to try to use that to inspire other people. So it's my pleasure. I'm honored to be here.
So let's just start right from the beginning. For me, the beginning is that story of, when you witnessed the violent death of your mom. That's the beginning that I know. And I don't know if that's truly the beginning, for you, but that was the story that I read and was referring to. So why don't you start with, just telling us your story?
Sure. I think with everybody's story, the traumatic event in and of itself is typically not where the story begins, especially with a spontaneous act of violence. My mother was murdered in front of me when I was 14 years old. So there is certainly a lot of backstory. But for all intents and purposes, let's just start with that. Okay. So my parents were divorced when I was 5. So there was a lot of kind of turbulence and just, disconcernment in my youth to begin with about sort of where my place was and the shuffling back and forth and so forth. And my mother was a pretty troubled person. She was a very complicated person, a magnanimous personality. She happens to be like a very beautiful physical specimen who was tortured by some of her own demons. So she really suffered from, although she never had an actual psychiatric diagnosis, the people who have heard about her behavior and so forth years later, because you have to remember, we're talking about the 1980s, where when you were talking about psychiatric diagnoses and treatment and so forth, it just wasn't as prevalent as it is today. And it was also something, depending upon your upbringing, whether it was kind of shoved under the carpet and people just didn't really talk about it. So that's certainly what my life was like, where nobody really talked about a lot of the things that were troubling her. So it is believed that she was bipolar and she suffered from alcoholism and a lot of what we could just call isms, just everything she did was, excessive and extravagant. So she had a lot of turbulent relationships and so forth. So for the intents and purposes of what happened, I had actually been living with my father at the time that I was with my mother on that particular weekend, because her and I had just had a lot of struggles due to her alcoholism, that I was kind of taken from her. And then I was able to go back to her. So the irony was, this particular weekend, she was involved in a very difficult romantic relationship that went south. And basically he was a police officer who she was romantically involved with, and he killed her. And so it was. I had lived through a lot of years of their back and forth turbulence. So that particular night, things certainly felt off to me, but that wasn't an unusual experience. So I happened to have been there. I was 14 years old and I heard a gunshot. I was in bed. I was watching The Wizard of Oz. There's certain things that you associate with it, right? Like, I'll never forget, like, anytime now that I see The Wizard of Oz come on, it's kind of like a trigger point for me. And I heard a gunshot, went outside because, of course, it was jarring. And while some people might have heard that and stayed inside, it was such an instinctual response to me that, of course, I ran outside. And I was involved in a little bit of a scuffle that was going on outside. My mom obviously trying to get away from him. I don't believe that he had shot her at that time. I think it was he fired the gun to let her know. And then, from there it proceeded to, somewhat of a conversation between him and I, where he was kind of bartering with me to go back inside. I wasn't going back inside. And then, excuse me, and then he ended up shooting her 2 or 3 times, into the chest area. And so what proceeded afterwards was obviously me going inside and then eventually making a 911 call. So that was the event itself. And then sort of what happened afterwards is, long and sordid, with regard to like a very long and complicated trial that ended up with him getting acquitted by a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, which
Gosh.
was the first ever insanity plea to go through Lehigh County. I grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And there were a lot of components of the case that made it very compelling and sensationalized for a lot of news stories. So it was something that it had sex and drugs and rock and roll and politicians. My mother had been married a second time to a man who was a mayoral candidate. So, there were just a lot of factors that made it something that, the media kind of really descended upon. And so I became, kind of thrust into that spotlight. And then when he was acquitted, which sent a lot of people crazy, the New York Times, all kinds of things, because it was such an open and shut case.
Right.
Didn't seem at all that he was insane. Of course, one must be somewhat insane to shoot another human being, but in the eyes of the law, the definition of what makes somebody insane is not whether they are crazy in terms of their behavior. It's about whether they purely knew the distinction between right and wrong. Do you understand what you're doing is right and wrong? And when somebody shoots somebody and then they flee, that sort of signifies that they understood that there was something wrong about what they were doing. So that's the event itself.
And so when he shot your mother 2 or 3 times in the chest, were you watching that? Was that right in front of you?
I was, yes. I mean, it was dark. It was close to midnight, so I couldn't see, and they were probably about 10 to 12 feet away from me. So it wasn't like being in broad daylight. I didn't see a lot of it was more shadows. And truthfully, the things that I saw was the fire from the gunshot. It was more quick flash. And the thing that resonates with me to this day is not as much what I physically saw as much as what I smelled. It was the smell of gunpowder that really kind of, when you talk about prolonged trauma and things that you try to work through, it was that smell. It took me many, many, many years to kind of be able to get through that.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I can absolutely imagine. And then I also, the story that you shared on Instagram, and, and it's up to you if you feel like you want to share it in detail today, but I know you talked a lot about the guilt around the death of your mom and, the things that happened that night, and how you have to live with guilt. And I think a lot of people, obviously this is your trauma that you went through is an extreme circumstance, but I think a lot of people out there live with guilt for, one thing or another, whatever it may be, and can't release it, can't get over it. And you talked about in your Instagram post about the guilt that you felt that night, and you were very detailed about, why you felt guilty and how you have dealt with that over the years. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that guilt really plagued me for a long time. I think, I'm really happy to say that at this point of my life, let's see, 40 years later, almost 35 years later, I've kind of accepted that, like I've really worked through a lot of it. But certainly at the time, the most common feeling of guilt was about the fact that right after she was shot, when I went into my home, I was scared for my own life. I was convinced that he was going to come in for me because I witnessed this, right? So like, why wouldn't he, how is he going to just leave knowing that I saw it happen? And I think that, in hindsight, that was a very natural instinct, right? Is to feel that. So I had gone into a basement toy closet. I hid myself and I truthfully to this day, I don't know how long I was in the toy closet. It felt like 10 minutes, but it might have been, when the police were stitching the timeline back together in terms of when I called 911, when they are able to stitch that back together, it really turns out that I was in the closet for maybe 2 minutes. Do you know what I mean? Like maybe 2 minutes.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, when you're talking about guilt, you're not talking about logic. Okay.
Right.
You're not about what makes sense. You're talking about what you internalize as the truth. And so I kind of felt to myself that what would have happened if I had not gone into the toy closet? What would have happened if I had gone straight for the phone, called 911 immediately, because my mother was not dead at the scene. She actually died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. So, in my mind, I was thinking if I had reacted quicker, could they have saved her? But again, Chrissy, I mean, the hindsight of thinking about that, I recognize that that is a really tall order for a 14-year-old girl to know exactly what to do. And also, there were so many other circumstances involved in the sense of how long did it take the ambulance to get there? What if that was the 2 minute difference? What if the time didn't matter at all? And I think that the biggest release of my guilt was when I finally recognized that it wasn't my responsibility to save her. That wasn't my responsibility. It was the responsibility of him not to have done it. So I, kind of was able to forgive myself, if you will, because when I look back on it, especially all these years later, I actually think that like I did a great job at responding to the most horrific traumatic experience that one could really experience. Watching your mother get shot in front of you. I mean, if it happened to me now at 50 years old, who's to say that I would have done the right thing? So, but I do think, just talking for your listeners, that guilt is a really debilitating emotion, and it clouds your logic. It gets in the way. And this is a really important point, I think, at least it was for me, is that when you make a decision like I did a few years ago to say, you know what, I'm done kind of just getting through this. I need to heal. Like I need to heal, and I deserve to heal. I deserve that. Like that was the biggest permission that I gave myself, if you will, to say, you know what, I deserve not to just survive this and live my life to tell my story, but I deserve to heal because I'm somebody who really believes in passing on generational trauma. And that is something that, despite the fact that I could be doing all of the things that I think are good for my kids, trauma is passed on from generation to generation. So for me to heal, that helps my children, so I think that was something. And I realized that, to heal, you have to work through that guilt. So for me, that was one of the first things that I really started to attack, if you will, with regard to my own wellness journey.
Yeah. I absolutely love what you said about when talking about guilt, you're not talking about logic, because I do think that is such an important point, because it is what a lot of guilt is, the stories that we tell ourselves and make up in our own head, all of the what ifs that are not facts. at all. It's just the what ifs, what if this, what if that. And it can be just extremely debilitating and, in all aspects of your life. So, I really appreciate what you said about that and couldn't agree more. So now that you have given yourself permission to heal and, about how long did that take for you to kind of get there?
Regarding the guilt specifically.
Yeah, and or just in general, like just realizing that giving yourself permission to heal, to be happy, to deserve every happiness, to not pass on generational trauma, like all of those things.
Yeah. I mean, it's a difficult question because it's not like a flip over moment.
Yeah,
There was a particular day that I woke up and said, today's gone, right?
right.
It's like, like a snake shedding its skin. It happens gradually and it takes a little bit of time. So I don't know the exact moment. I would say that probably about 5 years ago or so, it was when I made a conscious kind of mindset shift to say,
Gotcha.
like, I don't want to just skate by, get to the end of the day and feel like, okay, I made it through another day and everything is okay. I knew I wanted more for myself. And yeah, so I think, so that's a long time when you think about the fact that if it was 5 years ago and I was 45 years old and this first trauma happened when I was 14, and I'm not sure, Chrissy, if you know this, and I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about this per se, but the kind of bookend to that was a year after my mother died, my father died. So, and in that guilt of, that was another issue for guilt, which is that I was living with my father. He had juvenile diabetes. And so he died of natural causes. It was kidney failure. He was getting ready to go on dialysis and he was on a kidney transplant list. So he had been sick for quite a while, but I certainly was not expecting that he was going to die, and so about
Yes.
months after my mom died, I was getting ready for school one morning, and my father was a very routine, regimented man, and he wasn't downstairs. And for the sake of brevity, because we don't have a ton of time, is that I walked in and found my father was, he had died in his sleep. So again, there was a lot of guilt in that too, right? Because it was my dad and I alone in the house together. And so, of course, I kept thinking to myself, well, what if I had walked into his room at midnight? How did I wait till 7:30 in the morning? So we were dealing with double traumas back to back. And so I was orphaned, completely orphaned by the time I was 15 and a half. So there was that, trauma too. So I think that's maybe why it took me so long to get to the point of healing, because there was just so much to go through, so much.
That is just so much for any human being to handle, let alone a 15-year-old, like in your mid teens. I mean, that's a tough time in life to begin with, and to have to deal with losing both parents and being a part of that, seeing it, being the one to find them. That is a lot to take on. And so here you are, you're 15 and a half years old and you're orphaned. Like, what does that look like? What happened?
Well, I was very, very lucky in the sense that I wasn't in a foster care situation. I went into what's called kinship care, which basically means that I moved in with my grandparents, and I was very lucky about the fact that my grandparents, my father and his father, had been in business together. So I was very close to my grandparents. So, albeit a huge age difference, a big generation gap, a lot of, a 15 and a half year old, angry, confused, scared teenage girl now moving in with my grandparents who are in their 70s, and they're traumatized because they just lost their son. So you put a bunch of traumatized people in the same environment without tools.
Right.
It was precarious to say the least. But this is what I will say, is that I was very, very lucky because they loved me. They didn't know what support necessarily to give me because they were trying to figure out what to do themselves, right? We were all kind of trying to pilot an airplane without a rudder, if you will,
Yeah.
so it was difficult. But, in my work that I've done with, many different orphans, it could have been much grimmer for me. So I never have lost sight of the fact that what happened was traumatic, but I was lucky on the other end because I did have a family there that was trying their best to give me support.
Yeah. Well, that is wonderful that you had them. And then it sounds like so then you took your experience and you founded the Orphan Society of America, which is amazing. So tell us a little bit about that society.
Sure. So what happened with the nonprofit is I had done a lot of work with different nonprofits. Probably 5 or 6 years or so after the traumas. I was in college and so forth. I worked for the National Crime Prevention Council. I was always, sort of that life had kind of pushed me into feeling like I had to be of service. It was something that I needed to do. I couldn't figure out what my niche was, so I did a lot of different things. I did things for the American Diabetes Association. They were always kind of tied to my parents, but
Yeah.
I didn't really know what my purpose was. I just knew that I had to try to give something. So what happened is I was a literary agent and an editor for a book company in New York City for years. And when I moved to the Philadelphia area, when I was getting married and I had my son at the time, I was home and I couldn't go back to my job in New York. And I was always the kind of person that needed something to do, but I also wanted to stay home with my kids. So founding a nonprofit was a very natural way for me to kind of continue my passion. And at that point, this was in about 2005. At that point, I had really synthesized a lot of my experience and had met a lot of people. I had been involved in a lot of different, grief, bereavement support groups, orphan advocacy, and so forth, that I felt, somewhat of an expert, if I could say that on the subject. And I was able to really reflect on what were some of the services that I would have needed when I was 15 or 16 that I just didn't have, that would have gotten me closer to my wellness healing journey than I was allowed to be because of all those other factors. So,
Yeah, that's it. So what's wonderful about that is you took all of your trauma and then trauma again and your experiences and, throughout the years, finding your passion and your purpose and turned it into something where you're of service to others and can help others that have, gone through a traumatic, violent experience as well. So I think that's really amazing that you did that because, it's helping you heal, I'm sure. And it also is, obviously helping all of these other orphans. So that's wonderful. And then I want to get a little bit into, sort of, you said it took till about 5 years ago, which was part of your healing process. And that is a long time. But I do think, being in my mid 40s now, I do think that, you just, your thought processes change. You're just a different person. I think you're much more introspective. You're much more forgiving of yourself. This is again me personally putting my opinions in, but I also think so. I know your company that you have now, Bold Wellness. Essential oils. I love following you on Instagram because you're always doing stories about things that are healthy and good for you, and meditative practices, the essential oils, but like all of these things that can just help you to be happy, right? Find more joy in your life, and do it in a way that is healthy. So I don't know when you started Bold Wellness, but do you think, were those two things kind of happening at the same time, you finding, your business and also then being able to release some of the guilt from the trauma?
absolutely. For me, the holistic and transformative kind of wellness services, if you will, are an exemplification of what has helped me, a lot. Where I was, for many years, kind of followed a very prescriptive, traditional go to talk therapy where I was diagnosed, right, like with, post traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, thrown into all these buckets, right, like just identified with all of these labels. And at that time, of course I believed it, right? So it was like, and I want to just, put a caveat out there first to just say that, that this is my personal experience. I am not making a blanket statement about pharmaceuticals or anything for other people, because for some people, it's 100% helpful and they need it. So I'm just speaking from my own, statement is that
Sure.
for years, I followed what the doctors told me. When the therapist got out his pad and said, we're going to prescribe you Zoloft or Ambien or Effexor or, whatever, I was prescribed 25 different medications to try to regulate my emotions, right? Because I was all over the place.
Right.
Yeah, very intense. I mean, I have an intense personality to begin with, but then when you take an intense personality and you throw some anxiety at it, you throw stressors at it. It was really magnified. So I followed that kind of protocol for a long time, taking medicines when I didn't feel well, if I had anxiety, take a Xanax, and I didn't really realize until a few years ago that none of that stuff was really working for me. Like it was numbing me out maybe, and it was dulling my edges, but it wasn't helping me heal. It was
Yeah.
helping the feelings to stop. And the reality is that you can't heal unless you are able to experience what you're feeling. And so I really made like a huge shift away from what I was using in the past to quote unquote deal or cope, to employing more holistic methods of, still therapy, if you will. They're healing modalities, things like acupuncture, things like massage, Reiki, the essential oils. That was an experience for me that really, really changed so much, because without getting too scientific, a lot of people think that essential oils are things that you buy in Whole Foods that you throw into your diffuser to make your house smell good. And I won't get into the distinctions between all of the different kinds of essential oils, but I will just say that there's a huge difference that the FDA doesn't regulate essential oils in our country, which means that a lot of people who are buying oils are buying basically what's just called aromatherapy grade, which the statistical numbers for what has to be in an aromatherapy grade oil versus what has to be in a therapeutic grade oil is a huge distinction. It's 95 to 5 versus 100 to 0. You know what I mean? So the changes that I was able to see in myself emotionally, because pure essential oils help to activate our limbic system, okay, which is actually, which is obviously a part of our brain. And a lot of our emotional patterns, the things that we tell ourselves and the things that we feel, are things that are stored up here. They're not things
Yep.
that, and they end up in all of our cells. It's a cellular memory thing. And through the use of real essential oils, you're actually able to reprogram and repatternize your thoughts, to kind of get in there and mess with the DNA. Because if they have done brain scans, MRIs of a trauma of somebody who has a traumatic brain versus somebody who doesn't, and the distinction is massive. So when you start employing methods that can shift those patterns, you can really see, some big changes. So for me, I was just able to experience a lot more growth, a lot more healing, and understood that there was a massive difference between the way that I was dealing with my trauma for the 30 years versus the way that I deal with it now. I used to be, very fast paced, very kind of frenetic. I was a very busy person. I was always on the go. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why, right? You know what I mean? I was
Right.
afraid with those emotions because I was afraid it was going to be a tidal wave and I would never be able to deal with it. So I would just go and go and go and go until I was so exhausted that I couldn't go anymore. And so now, I'm just so grateful and so thankful that I kind of had those epiphanies a few years ago saying, I want to do things differently and to allow myself to kind of be a newbie at
Right.
something, go into some of these.
Yeah. I mean, I'm grateful for that as well. I think, just from my own trauma in my life, which, wasn't a violent trauma, similar to yours. I just lost my mom, at an early age, and, dealt with some guilt around that, and all similar emotions. Right. And I think that, what you said about yes, you can take the medications to numb you out, or you can be so busy, busy, to try to, because as soon as you stop and you're in stillness, that's when the emotions come up, right? That's when sadness or whatever it may be. And I have found throughout my life, because it's been, 20 some years now, that it is about going through those emotions, feeling the pain, feeling the sadness, and getting through it, and then coming out on the other side feeling better for it, because you can't numb it out. You can't act like it's not part of you. It is part of you, and it always will be. But it's about how you think about it and how you're able to deal with it. And again, obviously, I'm such a big proponent of mindset and how we think, and training ourselves to think a certain way, and creating daily habits and strategies that support that. And I think that what you do with the essential oils and everything with I'm saying essential oils because I know that that's a big part of what you do. And I'm, dabbling in them recently, as you know, and I love it. I mean, just the way that they make me feel. And I'm certainly not using them to the extent that I could be, but, I do know that that's a big part of it. And I think finding the strategies and the things that can help you from a holistic perspective to not only, yes, help at the cellular level, but also help you to find joy and happiness, and just feel that way is huge. And I think it's really amazing what you've done, with your business, and how you are just have transformed your mindset, and how you really are healing yourself. And it's a process. And I would assume that it's a lifelong process that will never end. Right?
Absolutely. I'm sure that it will. It is exactly that. It is a journey without a particular starting point and an end point. I mean, the only thing that I can say is that I'm amazed at the difference in how I feel and what my outlook is, and how you can actually really and truly change that. Because I think a few years ago, I never really thought that I could wake up in the morning and be like super excited about my day. My mindset has shifted, and through the training, like what you talk about, mindset training, you people get stuck in this idea like, oh, people fundamentally can't change. I completely disagree. They can't.
Exactly. Yeah.
With whether or not you want to. And so for me, and for a lot of people, the stumbling block, the biggest obstacle was making the decision that I am allowed to change, and that I don't have to be stuck in old patterns, because that is what a lot of people get caught up with, which is this is just how I am.
Yeah. And don't you think people think that because and I get it, but that's the easy way out, right? That's the easy way out, to say, this is who I am and I can't change. This is what happened to me, and I'm the victim, and I will never be able to change. I can't get out of this, situation. And I think that it's easier to say that, and to stay in a place of negativity or sad feelings or whatever it is, that emotional space, than to then say, wait, I'm in control. I can switch my mindset. I can change my thoughts, but I have to work. It is work. You have to put the work in. So, but I can tell you, and I'm sure you would agree, that when you put in the work, the result is amazing, and it's transformative, and it will change every aspect of your life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that some people, though, Chrissy, I don't think everybody makes a conscious decision to say, I'm going to stay stuck. I'm going to stay doing this over and over and over again. I truly think that some people I think for myself, for a lot of years, I didn't know what to do to get myself out of that patternization. I was such a creature of habit. And, to go back to what you were talking about with guilt, I also think that subconsciously, one of the ways that we deal with guilt is by turning our mind into basically a prison, as a way to kind of punish ourselves. Where I think that I thought for a long time, I don't deserve to feel X, Y, and Z because I'm responsible for X, Y, Z. So when you start to untangle that and really start to question your beliefs, your own beliefs, not somebody else questioning you, but when you can look yourself in the mirror and say, am I telling myself the true story? Am I telling myself a story that I can use to make myself better? Because sometimes you have to change your story. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? In order to, sometimes you got to tell yourself little things, fake it till you make it. You know what I'm saying? Like there is some of that I believe in. And I'm a huge believer in vision casting and manifesting and acknowledging that a lot of people don't make progress in their own journeys because they don't even know what they want. They never ever make a decision. They never really meet with themselves and say, what do I want for myself? They don't even ask themselves the important questions. So I think that a lot of it starts there, which is by being willing to explore the possibilities. And also for me, I was very stubborn and I was very kind of on that gerbil wheel of these are the things that I know how to do. And then when I kind of surrendered and said, you know what, I am going to open myself up to do things like meditation, to do things like yoga, to break away from the fact that I was an ex-marathon runner. I used to run marathons because that's what I knew how to do.
Right.
And it was effective because it helped me get out a lot of energy because pain, any kind of emotion, guilt, pain, sadness, anger, any of it, it's energy. And I think that that's, when I started doing more energy work with Reiki and crystals, and I know some people think it's hocus pocus or whatever, and I understand that. You know what I mean? Like, I always understand that. But when you open up your mind to the possibility, and
Yeah.
not every, believe me, I've done a bunch of modalities that I say, this one's not really for me.
Yeah.
But
You have to find the one that works for you. And I'm just laughing because if listeners listen to the last two episodes prior to you, they are with a mystic, medium, Reiki master. And I personally, I believe in all of that. And I believe that energy work is extremely important. But so I just want to thank you so much for being here today and for, like I said earlier, just showing up authentically and honestly with us and sharing, your trauma and your story with us. And because it means so much to me that you did that. I know that's probably not an easy thing to do. And I very much appreciate it. And I would love for people to, check out Bold Wellness and to check out your business. So can you just tell my listeners, where can you be found on social? What's a good resource for them?
I am on Instagram at Tarah Baiman. It's TARAH with an H, and Baiman is BAIMAN. And then I'm obviously on Facebook too, just at Tarah Epstein Baiman. And then the website for Bold Wellness is www.boldwellnessco.com. There's that CO on the end, throws a few people off. But thank you so much, Chrissy, for having me. This was such a pleasure, and I hope that it can inspire others to just kind of dig down with themselves and realize that if you're stuck or if you're, hurting in any way, that there are solutions out there. And the pain never goes away. It's not about getting rid of it. It's about using that energy in a positive way to move forward.
Yep, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And, like I said, listeners, subscribe, rate, and review. Check Tarah out. Give us your comments. We'd love to hear from you. And I want to thank you all for listening today. And we will see you again next week.